I'm going to talk about the rise of ancient Mesopotamia, which starts in ancient Iraq, primarily in the Middle East. Of course, I'm going to talk about Sumerian culture mostly. I'll probably talk about a few other cultures as well, like probably the Akkadian culture, which comes in and kind of merges with the Sumerians. So that's mostly what I'll talk about today. So if you have any comments, questions during the live stream, do let me know. But also later on my channel, if you want to leave comments, or also in discussions in Canvas as well. So yeah, you saw that little short video I gave you. I just showed. They actually last year, I think they returned about something like 17,000 artifacts to like Iraq, like that had been taken basically after the 2003, I guess, that Iraq invasion and the war that followed. So they're kind of trying to restore things to Iraq afterwards, all the different, I guess, damage that was done to their antiquities. The same thing happened in Egypt, when they had that Arab Spring that occurred also as well. So it's kind of a big, big problem they still have in the Middle East. And there's a big black market, for a lot of things that are stolen, like antiquities and things like that. But let me get to, of course, the main lecture today. I'm going to talk about, of course, the Sumerian culture, mostly, like I said. But previously, we had talked about some of the early civilizations, like the so-called river valley civilizations that had gotten started in ancient times. Like I guess at the end of the Stone Age, you start having these civilizations coming in. You remember Mesopotamia was the oldest, based around the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Then we told you India, about the second oldest, mostly in South Asia, based around mostly the Indus River, also the Ganges or Ganga River as well. China, Yellow River, mostly, or the Wangho, eastern part of Asia. And then Egypt, a little younger than the other ones, they say. It's based in North Africa around the Nile River basin, modern Republic of Egypt, of course, as well. So I'm going to get to talking about ancient Mesopotamia, which you see here in this image. So you can see Mesopotamia, kind of the location where we're talking about, is an area mostly in modern Iraq, would be mostly where it is. Although I guess you can include some like maybe around where Kuwait is, Syria. I think part of southern Turkey would be also another area of about the location of where ancient Mesopotamia was. If you remember correctly, the term Mesopotamia meant land between the rivers. I don't know if I've talked about that or not, but it comes from like two Greek words. The word meso means middle or between in Greek, and then potamus is the Greek word for river. So you get the term land between the rivers being kind of used later by the Greeks when Alexander the Great invaded into that region about the 4th century BC is probably when the term started to be used. And that writer on the left you see there, Arian, I think they sometimes call him Arian of Nicomedia, was really one of the first, I guess, ancient Greek writers to really write about that region and separate it from, I guess, the rest of the world. Arian had a book called The Anabasis of Alexander, which was considered, by the way, the greatest books probably written about Alexander's like military campaigns. And so I think he was living about 2nd century BC is when he lived. And so that the term Mesopotamia kind of stuck afterwards. After that term started being used, of course, by the Greeks. So you can see primarily it's an area you see between Iran and I guess the Arabian Peninsula deserts that are to the west of it. So it's kind of an area you see situated between like Turkey in the north, and then you got the Persian Gulf on the bottom. And you got both rivers running from, I guess, up in Turkey and Syria down through mostly modern Iraq today, the Euphrates on the left, and you see the Tigris River on the right being used. If you know much about that area, later, I think by the 19th century, I know the British started using the term cradle of civilization to describe Mesopotamia being the first, I guess, major civilization that sprouted up right there. And so it's the oldest of the river valley civilizations that go back further. So yeah, there's Mesopotamia in that location. They have other terms that became popular later. You'll see this, of course, also being used to describe that same region of Mesopotamia, which is the term Fertile Crescent, which is kind of like this. It was kind of like this geographic term that was invented by this professor at the University of Chicago at Illinois. His name is James Henry Breasted. He was an archaeologist and also an Egyptologist. He was more of a specialist with studying ancient Egypt. But I think in the 1910s, he created the first map, like you see on the top left, where it had like the term Fertile Crescent being used. And so he talked about this area, this Fertile Crescent area, from like what is basically, you go back to there, comes from like Mesopotamia and Iraq, and it kind of arcs into like where Jordan and Syria is in Israel. So includes mostly the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, but also the Jordan River, which is more to the west, like where Israel is and all that. And it also, I think it sometimes includes the Nile River, as well, kind of arcing down into there. That whole area is the Levant, they called it, that's in that western part, from like Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt today. And so that's a term that they often use for that area. So those are terms that are common today with the region, Mesopotamia, of course, and Fertile Crescent. Of course, now I'll get to it later, but they eventually, by the 20th century, they dropped the name Mesopotamia. They start using the name Iraq, which is the modern name, like the Republic of Iraq today in that area. Now, I'll get to it later. That's a name that was derived from an ancient city of Mesopotamia, which is called Iraq, which is where Gilgamesh was from, like the king Gilgamesh in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that kind of became a popular name. They later kind of borrowed for later for that area. But let me go ahead and I'm going to move on. I want to talk about a few other things I sometimes talk about Mesopotamia, which is the fact that a lot of biblical stories are often connected to Mesopotamia, which is pretty much true about that. Like even the story of Noah and his ark, you see in the Bible, in Genesis, is a good example of that. But yeah, the Garden of Eden, you see there, that's considered, one example of a topic which often shows up in a lot of stories in Mesopotamia. Like the Sumerians kind of mention a place called Dilmun, I think it's called, that's kind of equivalent to Eden in the Bible. Genesis is like at the beginning of Old Testament, Genesis 2:4 to 3:24. It's about where it's located, and I think there's been some theories that there may have been actually an Eden, but I think it was based more in the Persian Gulf. Is where it was. And I think there's even some speculation some islands in the Persian Gulf may have been where it was. Of course, the other story is Noah's Ark. The story of the flood story. That's in Genesis 6-9 as well. That's another example. There's a lot of stories in Mesopotamia about floods occurring. Like if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's examples of talking about floods and things like that as well. And so that's another example of something you see as well. In Mesopotamia. Also, the Tower of Babel is mentioned as well. That's Genesis 11. And so that's another story. They think that this particular story may have been influenced by some various ziggurats or step-type pyramids that were being built by the Sumerians and other peoples that lived in that area. And so the story of the Tower of Babel, of course, comes about later because of that. So that's one, and I know also the story of Abraham is also, I guess, another story they sometimes link to Mesopotamia. Genesis 11-25, that would be, of course. But It's believed that Abraham was born in the city of Ur, which at one point was, I guess, an early city-state of, they think, the Sumerians. So that might go back to that time period, or maybe a little later of when that was. But that's another story that's often kind of a character that's kind of in there as well. Now I'm going to get to, and of course, we'll talk more about Iraq, like to get into the actual ancient peoples. If you look at Iraq itself, like the actual state that you're looking at, it's more of a state that did not really come about until really after like World War I and World War II. So that's when really Iraq comes about as a modern state. Overall, I think it really just started as a kingdom, and then over time it became a republic, which is now. And of course, Iraq is, like I told you before, that short little video at the beginning. They've gone through a lot of wars, like quite a lot, going back to like the Iran-Iraq War. So they've gone through a lot of devastating conflicts, which has really caused a lot of problems with Iraq. And then Iraq was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who was kind of a dictator for a bunch of years. But let me get into, of course, there's the city of Iraq. That's kind of where the name comes from over time. We'll talk about that later, but that was considered the greatest Sumerian city that they built, which they think was the largest in size. That's kind of like ruins of part of the city, which you're looking at right there in that image. We'll come back and talk about that. But let me first talk about that area of Iraq and Mesopotamia. We're talking about mostly the peoples that lived there that were dominant were what we call Semitic people. Back early on in Mesopotamian history, like the early history anyway, a lot of it is dominated by mostly people that are from that region, like in the southwestern part of Asia, which are so-called Semitic peoples. Semitic peoples are mostly peoples that are based on languages that are mostly written from right to left. Got some on the screen there, but that's the bulk of most of the Semitic peoples that kind of live throughout that region. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, the Israelites, the Phoenicians, the Chaldeans, Arabs, and then Jews kind of formed from the Israelites, of course, later that they have. It's believed that if you know about the term, Semitic being used, it was originally derived from a term from the fact that they were related back to the sons of Noah, like Ham and Shem, and of course, like the Jews and others related back to Shem, like Arabs, etc. And so you'll often hear that term Hamito-Semitic, I think was the old archaic term they used to say how they were related back in the Bible, but they're not sure if those terms are really accurate or not, like whether they really are related back or not. But now they use the term Afro-Asiatic to describe a lot of these peoples that live in southwestern Asia and also in like parts of North Africa as well. I think I've got another image showing like North Africa along with, southwestern Asia. So yeah, all those Afro-Asiatic peoples would be included into those areas, like the Kushites, Berber, Egyptians, etc. would kind of be included also with those groups as well. So mostly it's Semitic peoples that really, dominate Mesopotamia in the first, couple thousand years or whatever, few thousand years. And then you get like all these other people that come in later. You have also the so-called Aryan peoples that come in as well, which Aryan peoples were peoples that came out of like close to Eastern Europe. Like you see where it says Ukraine right there, would be that area right there. These would be like Indo-Aryan, Indo-European peoples. And at least in the Mesopotamian region, I guess the ones that become dominant later will be the Hittites who were in Turkey, and then the Persians who are in Iran right there. They're all kind of related somewhat to each other. And then you got Europeans, you see like, I guess, Greeks, Romans, and people like that you have in Europe more to the west. They're kind of all somehow descended from each other, they theorize anyway. But they do think there was some kind of Aryan migration where all these peoples basically migrated throughout the world. And the term Caucasian was later used, because of the Caucasus Mountains, which are like in kind of like southern Ukraine, where Georgia is, between the Baltic. Yeah, between the Caspian and Black Seas is where it was. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. I want to talk about, of course, the main thing we'll get to today is the Sumerian culture that eventually dominates Mesopotamia for a couple thousand years or so. And a little bit of background about the Sumerians. If you look at kind of this image right here, they do think the Sumerians were considered the first major civilization to develop in the world. Like really, one of the oldest overall. And Sumer, of course, they have different names that they go by. They think that the land of Sumer was primarily located in what would be now today southern, southeastern Iraq. Is about where it is. Have you ever heard of cities like Nasiriyah, Basra? That's about the area of where Sumer started, like the Sumerian culture, etc. So it says 3000 BC, but I think some people think it's more like 6,000 years ago or more, maybe further back than that they started. You can see some of their key cities. You can see there, Eridu, Iraq. Those are the ones that are the most famous overall. And that man right there in the middle, kind of talk about him off and on, but Sir Charles Leonard Woolley was really considered one of the first major archaeologists to go to like Iraq in the 20th century. And he was a British archaeologist that was was really considered one of the first modern archaeologists. He was really methodical about his methods of archaeology and keeping like records of what he was doing. And so a lot of people kind of consider him to be one of the early fathers of archaeology. And he's kind of instrumental in popularizing a lot of archaeology and history of early, ancient Iraq, like a long time ago. And here's kind of another image of Leonard Woolley right here. Woolley was known for a bunch of things at what is the city of At which we'll talk more about later. He actually did excavations there for like something like a little over a decade. And I think I want to say 12 years he was there from 1922 to 1934. He was actually famous for excavating, I guess, the ziggurat that's there. I'll get to later, the ziggurat of but primarily that they have this massive royal cemetery that he found there in the 1920s, which had something like 2,000 people buried there in it. So he was like really one of the, I guess, the groundbreaking archaeologists that really got a lot of the early history of the Sumerians going at that time. Here's kind of a map showing you like the area of where Sumer is. They have different names. They also mention the Bible. I'll mention it, but Shinar is a common name. They sometimes call that area of Mesopotamia, which is mentioned in Genesis 10:10, where they talk about Shinar and all the different cities that were there at the time, like Babylon, Iraq, and Akkad, which a lot of these were later civilizations that would dominate that area that you're looking at. Out of those cities you're looking at, I'll kind of just briefly talk about the ones that are there. Like I said, the largest one that they built, the Sumerians, was called Iraq, which is spelled different ways. You'll see it also spelled E-R-E-C-H. I think is another way it's also spelled as well. And then they think that that's where the name Iraq came from. I-R-A-Q kind of evolved from that. And they think it may have been about 80,000 population that may have lived there at one point. And most of their cities were made of mud brick. That's pretty much typical of what a lot of the early states, built there at the time, because didn't have a lot of stone. And so predominantly, if you study about um, Mesopotamia, most of it was based off of an agricultural type society where farming was kind of important. And mostly they grew like grain crops, like barley, wheat, millet, date palm, sesame, things like that would be typical kind of crops they grow, throughout that region, along with, I guess, vegetables and fruits and other things like that that they normally grow as well. And there's different names, like what it means. I think the theory about Sumer is that Sumer means either land of the civilized kings, which is the common name that they think the Akkadians called them, like civilized rulers that were there. And then there's another term you see on the bottom there, which is they think in the Cuneiform, or at least in the Sumerian term that they use for their own people, they said land of the black-headed people or peoples. That's what they used, which has kind of been kind of a mysterious term, which has been debated about what that meant. But I think they said they shaved their heads, the Sumerians, but it's believed that they may have worn caps that were kind of black looking, or maybe they did have black hair, which there's kind of a debate about where the Sumerians are from. I think they've never figured that out, like the origins of the Sumerians and where they originate and things like that. And I speculate from the east, but that's still unknown at the time. If you go to the back of the map there, other cities that are there too, they think Eridu, which you see there to the right of in the map, is considered one of the oldest cities. So out of the different ones they probably had a dozen or more cities they had, but that one dates back to 5,000 years or so. And they do think that Eridu might be one of the oldest cities in the world. It was first built, or at least a large-sized city, not like Jericho, which was more like a farming village or something like that. Because Eridu may have been 30, 40,000 population-wise, to kind of give you an idea. And then the other thing about you see there, that's famous for, they think, where Abraham was born, like I just told you. But that's kind of why it's famous now. But it became famous because of the archaeological digs that were done later, especially because of Leonard Woolley. Let's talk about some other things. Of course, here's kind of another map showing you. You can see there, like the whole heartland, of where Sumer was. Later, what's going to happen? They'll be absorbed into other cultures. Like the Akkadian culture will come in, kind of absorb them, and then they're also later kind of absorbed into like the Babylonian Empire that'll come later, like under King Hammurabi. So all that's going to kind of be incorporated into one large empire. But at the time when the Sumerians first started, it was mostly just a collection of city-states that were all independent. Now, I'll kind of talk about some things that the Sumerians were very, very famous for. The most famous thing that they're well known for is cuneiform, which, if you know about cuneiform, it was the first major language system or written language system that was developed in the world. And I'll give you a definition of it, but it's basically a type of logosyllabic script writing system. What I mean by that is the fact that it was a type of writing system that used like pictograms and ideograms, like symbols that represented an alphabet. And this particular type of writing system was very complicated. Like it had hundreds of different symbols that were used. And it's pretty old. It goes back like at least 6,000 years old, like maybe 4,000 BC, maybe when it was first developed. And it was written from Sumerian times down to the time of like King Nebuchadnezzar II. And they were using it in Babylonia. And this type of writing system did not use paper, which I guess hadn't been invented yet. I mean, Egyptians will have papyrus later, but they used wet clay tablets where they used like that with some kind of like a stylus, probably a wooden type reed stylus, to make marks in wet clay. And then they would take the tablets and harden it out in the sun. And so cuneiform, I've got like images right here you see, Well, like I said, very complicated. I think they say originally it did have up to 2,000 symbols that were used. And then over time, they evolved into, I guess, less complicated systems where they had maybe 500 or more, 600 symbols being used. But it's believed there was a man that coined it. His name is Thomas Hyde, who I think lived about maybe close to about 1700. He was an Englishman, and he was the one that coined the term cuneiform, which comes from two words. Cuneus, it is the word meaning wedge, and then form as in shape, wedge shaped. And it had to do with the fact that the symbols that were used had kind of a wedge looking shape due to the stylus being, that's used with the process in writing. And so it kind of, the name stuck. So they don't know what they called it back then, but it was obviously something that was, something you had to be skilled with. So only small groups of professional scribes could master it like real well, apparently. And I think if you study today, there's very few cuneiformists that can actually write and read it. I want to say a few hundred, maybe they can do it throughout the world. And the British Museum in London has the largest collection of cuneiform tablets, which is something like 130,000. But they do think they found something like 2 million throughout the world, but maybe 5% have been translated. Not many have been translated. So there's a lot of cuneiform tablets out there that, still there's unknown of what is actually written on them. Predominantly, they think that cuneiform was mostly used for record keeping, like different kinds of records about things like economics or farming or whatever. They kept records on. And they wrote some like poetry, epic poems, of course, as well. But primarily, that's mostly what it was used for. Here's some kind of images looking right there as well. I've got this image right here showing they think how cuneiform evolved, but they do think it probably evolved from looking at objects or taking ideas and creating them into symbols that represented like an alphabet or ideas. And so they use like pictograms or ideograms. And you see this also with like hieroglyphs as well, in their kind of language in ancient Egypt also. Yeah, it does have an alphabet. So that's something they do figure out later also with cuneiform and also with hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphic type languages are also like an alphabet as well. There is one thing that's famous about the Sumerians. They did create one of the oldest stories probably in human history, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I'm sure everybody's heard of that story. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a 10-book story, or really on 10 tablets, that was written about the king of Iraq, who they think lived in the 21st century, might be the most famous Sumerian king that they had. It's kind of debate about whether he was real or not. Some people think he may have been a legend. Also, the name is debated. Some people think it's Gilgamesh, and then sometimes you'll see it with a B, Bilgamesh. It's also sometimes the way it's also spelled as well. But it talks about a lot of stories about Gilgamesh, adventures that he goes on. And I know one main adventure that he's involved in, which is real famous, is his quest, like a search for immortality. It's one of the main things, I guess, is the story that's kind of in it. And there's different versions of it. Like there's like an Akkadian version, which is the one that I think everybody reads now, which is about 700 BC. And that story was found in the Royal Library at Nineveh later in modern times. And there's Gilgamesh right there, who may have ruled over, I guess, was like what maybe the city looked like of Iraq, which is, by the way, the namesake, I said, again, of Iraq, of course, today. And there's a story in there where he meets this man named Utnapishtim, you may have heard of, who was a Sumerian hero that was kind of like an equivalent to Noah like the whole story of Noah and Noah's Ark. And he had this ship he built called the Preserver of Life that he constructed to try and save mankind from a great flood that was happening, of course, I guess back then. And so it does have some similarities to the story of Noah that we see in the Old Testament, in the Bible. In fact, I do have some comparisons with that, which are right there, but they do think it does parallel that both stories of Gilgamesh and of course, the story of Noah are kind of similar and kind of got comparisons right here I've kind of shown before, but on the left, you see in anger, the gods decide to destroy humanity in a flood, but Napishtim saves everybody, you can see. Then on the right, you see in Genesis, in anger, God decided to destroy all humanity in a flood, except for Noah and his family who survive in an ark. Then you see on the left there, Napishtim's boat lands on Mount Nisir, and the other one is Mount Ararat, you may have heard of course, as well. On the left, after the flood, Napishtim sends out a dove, a swallow, and a raven. And then after the flood, Noah sends out a raven and a dove. So kind of interesting about some of the similarities that are there, between the story of Noah and the flood and, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's another version, too, that they have. I don't think you have to know about this, but there's one called Atrahasis, or Haziz, which is a Akkadian version of the actual Epic of Gilgamesh, which is only in 3 tablets instead of 10. And it's mostly about the flood. That's all it is, about the flood. So kind of similarities with that story going on. But flood stories seem to be something you hear quite about, in that region, but also worldwide. You hear flood stories like all over the world. And so some people think there was a flood that happened like that, like you see in the Bible. Let me talk about some other things that the Sumerians were kind of known for, which inventions is something that they're real famous for, like all kinds of new kind of innovations and things that kind of come out later that other people copy. About that. I've got a bunch of them right here you can kind of look at, but cuneiform, which I just mentioned about, of course, probably the greatest thing that they invented. First writing system, of course, I just talked about. The wheel. They think the wheel is something they first perfected, and they started using the wheel to develop things like the chariot. And the chariot probably like the cart and the chariot are kind of similar. They were being used, and so wheels were made of like things like I guess they made like wood, stone, or later like metal being used as well. Bronze. They're one of the first to mass produce bronze on a large scale, which bronze, if you know about it, is mostly copper with some tin, maybe 20% tin in it. And so some of the first like weapons and tools are being used a lot, mass produced a lot, of course, by the Sumerians. The plow, which you're looking at there, something that they first invent as well, which kind of makes farming a lot easier. I think they're saying that the Sumerians were one of the first to really use mass irrigation, like from the Euphrates, Tigris rivers to irrigate their crops, grow their crops, and things like that. The sailboat, which a lot of early sailboats were made of reed, like reed boats, like you see in Mesopotamia and also in Egypt. And so those are initially some of the first kind of boats that come about. I'll get to it later. The ziggurat is also probably the second most famous thing, probably after cuneiform, is ziggurat, which were these massive temple tower type pyramids that they constructed, made of mostly mud brick. And they were kind of like civic centers that were primarily used as a temple, like for their religion. Of course, they're known for organized religion, which is, I guess, probably another thing they do as well. Beer, you see beer there, of course, probably another great invention. Probably one of the things that's still around today the most. Beer kind of is. And I think I remember reading about this before, but they actually found some kind of Sumerian tablet, like cuneiform tablet, that dates back to like 4000 BC, and it's a beer recipe, how to make beer. And then, of course, cities. They're the first to have, large size cities. At least I told you up to 80,000 people, maybe in size, and most of them were made of mud brick. Yeah, here's kind of like I guess it would be like an army, like a Sumerian army. So yeah, they're one of the first to have mass-produced weapons and large size armies and things like that. But they never progressed into like an empire. That's something that they don't really do. You won't really see that until the Akkadian culture comes in and kind of takes over Mesopotamia. Other things too, I'll talk about as well that they're very famous for: mathematics, Sumerian math. They were the first to really develop mathematics, which, if you know about the Sumerians, they had a form of math called sexagesimal. You may have heard about this. It's a type of numerical system based on 60, basically. And so that's what led to the idea that there's, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, that kind of thing. And then they came up with a 24-hour time also as well. So 12 months in a year, 360 days initially, 30 days a month, 24 hours, 60 minutes, and so on. So all that was kind of developed from the Sumerians and mathematics. And so they had that, they had engineering, they had astronomy, all kinds of things that they began to kind of develop at the time. And so, yeah, like the term, 180 degrees, 360 degrees. Those are something that they invented, like a long time ago. So I got to get to class in 60 minutes, that kind of thing. So they invented that. So sexagesimal. Another thing too, law codes. People think of Hammurabi Code, right? Actually, the Sumerians invented the first written laws. There was actually a law code system called the Code of Ur-Nammu, who was a king that lived about 4,000 years ago. He created the first written law codes. And kind of show you right here the law codes. There's some examples of them right here. That's actually him at the top in the middle there, King Ur-Nammu, who, by the way, built the Ziggurat of Ur. We'll get to that in a second. And but yeah, those are some examples of some of the things that were in the Code of Ur-Nammu. Don't kill, obviously. Don't steal. Don't kidnap. Those are some of the first ones you see at the top, which I guess kind of similar to some of the ones you see there in the 10 Commandments, like the 6th one and, of course, the 8th one. Don't kill, don't steal. You see, it's kind of like 1 and 2 with that. There's one, of course, rules about alimony payment, no adultery, don't assault people, don't bear false witness, don't lie under oath, don't do bad things to someone else's farm. Those are kind of similar to like what's in the Old Testament with the 10 Commandments. But you can see Code of Ur-Nammu was developed in the 21st century BC, and then they think the 10 Commandments close to the 14th or 13th century is maybe when it was. Religion. That's another thing, of course, that they're very famous for. Sumerians do have extensive organized religion. So each city-state has a temple. Usually the ziggurat was where the temple was. Usually a tall structure in the whole city. And you can see those are, I think, worshipers, I guess, worshiping the gods in those images. And they had a lot of gods. Like I forget the number of gods. They had dozens and dozens of gods that they worshiped. But usually a city-state had a chief deity that they worshiped the most. Usually they're called Anunnaki, I think was the term they used for the actual gods of the Sumerians, because there was a god named Anu, we'll get to later on, A-N or A-N-U, was their chief deity, who I think later is kind of seen as an equivalent to like a Zeus or a Jupiter. I've got all the different gods, which are right here, but Anu or An, so he called him originally, was the chief deity of the Sumerians. He's kind of seen as this supreme god, like of the, I guess, of the heavens that lives in the sky. And I think I think the city-state of Iraq also kind of worships him too, as well as a chief god. That's mostly where he was mostly dominant as an actual god, and he's also got different children. Like he's got a bunch of children that are actually deities, which is kind of similar, almost like Zeus or Jupiter, because it's like the mythology of Zeus or Jupiter. He has all these different children by different I guess consorts or whatever. And Anu is Enki and Enlil. I think they consider those two gods to be like his two main sons that are the most famous, that are kind of part of a triad of gods. I think Anu, Enki, and Enlil are kind of seen as the most powerful gods initially of the Sumerians. Enki is mostly a god of like the water and earth, and he's usually associated with Eridu, that city I told you about. That was one of the oldest that was first built, and that was his chief center of worship. Enlil is mostly the wind god. He's associated with the wind, air, like storms, desert storms, and bad weather. And he was associated with the city-state of Nippur. Later, they have a god, Marduk. That's real popular as well. He is a god of Babylon. That becomes like the chief god that's worshipped there, like down to the time of King Nebuchadnezzar II. He's a god of water, a god of also dealing with magic, and he was believed to be a son of Enki. So it's kind of like a grandson of the god Anu, if you want to put it that way, with the lineage. And I think later Marduk has a son too that's famous called Nabu. That's well known. I think was a god of wisdom. That's where Nebuchadnezzar gets his name later. Other gods, these are not as famous, but the god Sin, which is sometimes called Nanar, I think is also translated that way, is a type of moon deity, which worships the most as a city-state. Shamash is kind of famous by Babylonian times, sometimes called Utu, is mostly a god of the sun and also the god of justice. Sipar and Larsa are the chief gods that city-states that worship that particular god. Ninkasi, she's another goddess, which is also kind of famous. She's often associated with like brewing, like the brewing of alcohol, like beer, and stuff like that. And Ninkasi was a daughter of Enki. Namu, not as well known, but Namu is a sea goddess, which was famous in Sumerian mythology. And then also Inanna, we'll talk about her later, which the Assyrians call Ishtar, was probably considered one of the greatest female gods, really, of Mesopotamia. She was a fertility goddess. It's well known among the Assyrians and Babylonians. By the way, the Sumerians do have an afterlife. So they do kind of believe that there's some type of underworld where souls go to. They call it Kur, K-U-R. And Kur was believed to be somewhere to the east. They think the entrance to it was located where the Zagros Mountains is in western Iran. And Kur has a kind of an equivalent to what would be what they call Sheol, like to the Israelites later, or Jews. And then the Greeks call it Hades. So it's kind of an underworld, which is kind of influential to that. And it's kind of a gloomy place. It's almost like, not like a hell, but it's not like a heaven we think of to them. So they had a complicated religious system. They had priests that were involved in the various temples. They do think they had some kind of idols that they worship that were in some of the temples. They talk about some of the statues they built being very large in size, like mentioned, I think, in the Bible and other sources. Now, one more thing I'll talk about, which is very famous, probably the other thing that's probably more famous, I guess, just as much after cuneiform, is the ziggurat. The ziggurat was something that the Sumerians were very known for in other cultures throughout Mesopotamia. And ziggurats were these, like I said, large size mud brick pyramid structures that they constructed as mostly a temple. It was also used as like a civic center to like run the government of the city state. And here's kind of an outline of what a ziggurat looked like. So it was a multi-tiered structure with, I think, the top of it being where the main part of the temple was, where they would probably keep idols in there, like of their main god. And they say the word ziggurat was an Akkadian word from the word Ziggurata, which means an Akkadian mountain of God, or I guess the god resided on top of it. And one thing about ziggurats, the Sumerians and other cultures that came later would put trees and greenery on it to make it look like a mountain, which is why the name came about. I guess mountain of God. And I think that's kind of where sometimes they get this theory that maybe that's where the Sumerians came from like a mountainous region, like somewhere to the east, because that area is mostly flat desert, and so on. And so there's no mountains much in that area, a whole lot. So that's probably maybe where that came from, the idea, like from a mountainous areas of maybe Iran or somewhere in the east. Of course, there's been a lot of different ziggurats which are famous, like in the Bible. They've had the so-called Tower of Babel, considered the one that's the most famous one I told you about, which is in Genesis 11. And they think that there was a ziggurat built at the time of Nebuchadnezzar that's known as Entemenanki, which was believed to be one of the tallest ziggurats that was ever built in that region, which may have been 300 feet tall. And so, if you know the story about the Tower of Babel, it was built sometime after the Great Flood. And humanity tried to build this tower to heaven, and God got angry and made all the workers speak different languages, and so it was never completed. And so the term Babel, the word Babel, means confusion, because everybody was confused about they couldn't understand each other. But supposedly that's how all the different languages of the world came about. About that, with that story. But well, that's really true or not, we're not sure about that. But I do know that they think that when the Jews were in captivity under the Babylonians, they probably saw these huge ziggurats, and that may have been the inspiration to actually write that story. I think it's what some historians think today about how it may have come about. About some that were actually built that are famous now, the ones that I guess they rebuilt in modern Iraq, the Republic of Iraq, is the Great Ziggurat of Ur, or Ziggurat of Ur, which they think was built about 4,000 years ago. There it is right there. And that particular actual ziggurat was built, I told you, by this king called King Ur-Nammu, the one that helped write up the code of Ur-Nammu, the first law codes. And it's about 100-foot tall ziggurat that they think was constructed maybe close to about 2000 BC, either before or afterwards. And you can see it's a rectangular shaped pyramid structure, like a step pyramid structure made of mud brick, and 98 feet tall, about 210 feet by 148 feet length and width is the dimensions of it you're looking at right there. It has gone through different, like reconstruction, like parts of it were rebuilt, especially under Saddam Hussein, who was president of Iraq for many years. He helped restore a lot of some of their antiquities throughout modern Iraq today. He tried to rebuild that in Babylon. You know about that, and I think I read somewhere where he spent something like half a $500 million in reconstructing all these different antiquities from a long time ago. Here also, they think that back in the late 1920s, Leonard Woolley was believed to have found part of what is the House of Abraham. They think that's at that site at which is, by the way, not that far from Nazarea down the road. And of course, they later reconstructed the house. That's what you're looking at now. So I guess that must have been done under Saddam too, as well. But that's kind of debated, like whether that really was his house or not. I think possibly they think, so-called House of Abraham, but that's what that is in that image. Now, there are other ziggurats that were built that were famous as well. I'll get to it when we get more into the Babylonians, but the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was also considered a ziggurat as well. It was constructed in the 6th century BC, and this actual palace, which is really what it was actually built for his wife, who I think was from Iran, ancient Iran at the time. And it was considered one of the 7 wonders of the world when it was built. And it was, of course, famous for like all the different trees and greenery that was put on it. And it actually had mechanical waterfalls. They were put on it as well. And so that was considered to be, one of the greatest ziggurats also built in Mesopotamia. And it was not as tall as in Temanaki, which I told you may have been 300 feet tall. That one may have been 80 feet tall on average. Here's kind of an image. That's, of course, Babylon later that they'll have, they think in Temanaki is something that Nebuchadnezzar builds later as well. You can see the Ishtar Gate, one of the main entrances into the city, but a lot of that's not built till later. Not the same time, of course, as the Sumerians. Let me get into also next. They have this other empire that kind of comes in at the end of the Sumerian. The Sumerians begin to decline as a culture. They never really united as like a major kingdom or empire, and you get this empire that emerges, which is the Akkadian Empire, which I'll kind of see right here. Which you can see controlled at one point most of modern Iraq, but it pushed actually at one point up into Syria and into Asia Minor, which of course is also Turkey. And the Akkadian Empire was the Semitic type empire that was built by this king named Sargon of Akkad, who they think lived in the late 24th century BC. I think they think he probably came to power about 2430 BC is what it is. And on the left there, you can see that's actually like a statue of his head. Which I think they say that's considered the oldest statue of a actual ruler of Mesopotamia that reigned. And the Akkadian Empire was actually a multi-ethnic empire that was mostly made up of Akkadian and Sumerian people. So the Akkadians took over Sumer, they absorbed it, into their state, and then they created this empire that was more influenced by probably Sumerian ideas more than anything, because they absorbed a lot of their language, their gods, their technologies, and things like that. And they have you go to that map there again, they had a major capital that was called Akkad, which they're not sure that the location of it. It's kind of south or southeast of Baghdad is where they think it is. They can't find the ruins of it for some reason, but it's got different names too. Agad or Akkad, I think, is the common name you'll see written in the Bible. But they do think it started out as a small city, and then over time it expanded until it became a kingdom and then an empire eventually. So here's kind of another image right there, but you can see the actual state lasted about, it varies, but maybe 180 years, less than 2 centuries that they were in power between the 24th and the 22nd centuries. And you'll see different names for King Sargon. He was called Sargon of Akkad, Sargon the Great, Sargon the First. I think there's all kinds of names that he's often called, basically. But it is considered one of the first great empires that really, dominates Mesopotamia. And a lot of it was because of their military. They had a pretty good military, the Akkadians. And kind of show you this right here. But one weapon that they helped spread throughout, and why they're kind of considered a great military, was the composite bow. A composite bow was a new type of weapon, like a new bow and arrow that used what they call a laminated bow. It was a kind of a combination of like wood and animal horn that was kind of combined together as one bow. It was much stronger, could shoot arrows a lot farther. It was a lot deadlier at a closer range. So that was something that they really helped to kind of perfect, and then from there it spread, I guess, throughout the world from that location of Mesopotamia. Yeah, you can see here some of the rulers they had. They had like at least 5 major rulers that reigned, which roughly, I think it was Sargon. He had 2 sons, one named Ramush, I think they called him, who reigned. And he also had 2 grandsons that reigned later. So you can see Sargon reigned for about 40 years as the actual ruler. So yeah, you can see reigned between about the 24th to about the 23rd century. Some say it may have been 55 years. So it's kind of a debate about how many years he was in power. That was kind of like, look at that date. How they call it, 2334. I don't know, maybe that might be the date. So it's kind of close to that of when it was. Even had titles, King of the Universe. That was his actual title that he went by. So he conquered most of what would be the Akkadian Empire. And then you can see his 2 sons and his 2 grandsons would also, of course, reign as well. It fell apart. Like I said, it didn't last long. The Akkadian, it was hard to control it because it's such a large empire. Like I said, the empire went from the Persian Gulf up into Syria and Turkey at one point. And eventually they say in the 21st century, what occurred was basically the empire broke apart again. Actually, what happened was they got invaded by these peoples to the east in Iran that were called the Gutians. I'll kind of put them up here for the Gutians. Maybe about 2150 maybe is when it was. And this caused their empire to break up afterwards. They're not sure the origins of the Gutians, maybe related to Iranian peoples that are there. Zagros Mountains is like in the western part of Iran today. And what happened was Sumer came back. It was a period where Sumer, I think they call it Sumer, they call it Ur 2 and Ur 3. And the city-state of Ur was kind of dominant for a while. And so that's when, I guess, that King Ur-Nammu reigned primarily at that time. And then Sumer kind of reigns for a while. And then what happens, you can see there, the Babylonians then come in next. They'll come in and take over the region of Mesopotamia about 1800 is about when it is BC. And you get this king that comes in, you've heard of, named King Hammurabi. Hammurabi is going to, he's going to come in next. And he's going to create this empire called the Babylonian Empire, or at least the old Babylonian Empire. I think it's the name they use now for it, which will be around for about 2 centuries, from about 18th to about the 16th centuries BC. And it's like this Akkadian Sumerian type state that was actually ruled by these peoples called the Amorites. I'll talk about the Amorites later in the week, but the Amorites are like these Syrian peoples that come out of like the upper part of the Euphrates River Valley. And they actually control the actual state as a dynasty of kings, which Hammurabi was, of course, part of itself. And we'll talk about that later. Of course, I'll get more into getting in the Babylonian culture. Now I'll talk about also the rise of Assyria with the Assyrians as well. Don't forget, you've got that Canvas quiz on prehistory to wrap that up. So that's like something I told you about, of course, that I gave you last week. So, make sure that y'all get that done. I think I want to say due by next weekend, I know, coming up. And then, of course, I told you about the pre-test and this contract policy page. That's also due as well for y'all to wrap that up. I think that's due tonight, like I say, at midnight. I'll kind of send out more reminders about to get that done. But I don't think I've got too many other students here. I know I've had a few others that, of course, came in. I know looks like Madison came in. Hey, I missed you, I guess. And then Marissa. Looks like also we got also Gabriel Johnson as well, along with Christian. I don't know if I got Christian or not. Hey, Christian. So anyway, that's it for today. I'll see y'all later in the week. I'll send out, of course, announcements about my second lecture on Mesopotamia. My second lecture, like I said, will be on the later history of mostly the Bronze Iron Age of Mesopotamia, which I'll get into the Babylonian and Assyrian states. I'll also talk about the Hittites. They kind of briefly come in and sack Mesopotamia. I'll talk about them as well. But don't look like I have any questions or comments, I guess, that are pertaining to the lecture. But if you have a comment, question about the lecture, of course, you can, leave it on the channel, of course, on this video. Or, like I said, you can also send comments, questions to Canvas discussions overall. If you got a question about the class, also as well, don't forget, you can also email me as well. So y'all take care, and I'll see you, of course, later in the week.